Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you for coming. Beautiful day. Today I'm going to be talking about goals, dreams, and vision. This time is a time of great turmoil. It's also a time of great opportunity. So I'm going to go through different elements of that. And to begin with, I'm going to invite up Mrs. Ann Nelson, who's a good friend from a previous life in New York,
Yes.
in Carp a few years ago, to do the Bible quote from Matthew. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
Okay, so I'm humbled to read the words from, I'll say Hazenim, you know Jesus, from Matthew. Matthew, this is chapter 19, verse 28. Okay. Jesus said to them, I tell you the truth, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses, or brothers, or sisters, or father or mother, or children, or fields, for my sake, will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first.
Yeah, when we think of the life of Jesus, we often think of a glorious life and the way he's portrayed, even his birth, as a glorious birth in a stable. But I don't know how many of you have been to a stable recently, but it's not like Mission Hospital or New York Presbyterian Hospital. It's a very dirty place. It's not a very good place for the Messiah to be born. But he came out of that incredibly humble background. Jerusalem itself was an outpost of the Roman Empire, and he was a carpenter's son. So this is an incredibly humble beginning. But from that position of being what society today would look at as being last, he came to be able to restore a huge part of the world and be our Savior, to lay the foundation for true parents. So it's not always, sometimes we're in a position where we feel like there's nothing happening and we're not moving forward, but a lot of times God is preparing us for something much more, and I'll go through that in my own life in a little bit. The same is true for true parents. You know, father was a farmer in North Korea. This is not a very high position. It's actually a very low position in comparison. And when I worked, after I graduated from UTS, when I worked in Jardim, father was so happy to be down there fishing. I don't know how many of you have been to Brazil, and friends here from Argentina. You know, it's like 5,000 degrees in the shade. There's 10 million mosquitoes, and these are not small mosquitoes, these are really big mosquitoes. It's not, father's walking around so happy. Mother wasn't as happy, I can tell you. I could see she'd much rather be back at Saks Fifth Avenue or East Garden or other places. So it's an interesting situation when you see people that have come from a very, what we would say, a lowly position, and then see father speaking at the UN, speaking at these international conferences, mother addressing these world leaders, Ban Ki-moon, President Hun Sen. So a lot of times God will use people in an amazing way, from a very lowly position to a much more substantial position. So this week, Dr. Young has been talking a lot about the importance of Hundukek, and how if we're going to realize our dreams, we need to be able to prepare our second generation, and especially now the third generation, because most of our children, they're already on their course, they're already going a certain way, and they're not going to maybe change their habits or their lifestyles a great deal, although we're hoping and praying they can, but we can also invest in the third generation in another way. So Dr. Young has been emphasizing that we should educate our young people like that. And he was talking this week about how do we grow our spirit. And obviously through the Word of God. And I really believe we need to have a deeper understanding of both the Old Testament or the Torah and the New Testament, but also loving and caring for others. So I think as we're in these really turmoil times, we have to make sure we have a really good spiritual foundation. My own testimony, I'm originally from Melbourne in Australia. My family was really, really humble. We didn't have a car. My mother never worked after she had children. And my two elder sisters, they never even graduated high school. So they went to work when they were like 15 because we didn't have that much money. My mum was a really, really strong Catholic. My dad was an agnostic, so I was always stuck between these 2 points. Do I become religious or do we go more secular? And as a teenager, you don't really have much of an idea. I wound up going to a prep school run by French-Canadian brothers who was really, really super strict. And eventually I left school at the 11th grade level. I had a B average, but in this school, if you didn't have an A average, they didn't put you on to the 12th grade, so I would have had to change schools. So then I decided I'd just start working. So I started working in a bank, and eventually we had a branch in London. I went to London, and I traveled around Europe, and that opened my mind to the world. I'd grown up with Eastern Europeans. I grew up with Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Croats, Yugoslavs. And to me, as a young boy growing up in Australia, I never really understood the world. But I talked to all these people from all over the world. And I heard a lot of horror stories of how people from those countries would be sent to Siberia. It was very, very impressionable on me. And when I eventually came to the US in 1980, I joined CARP. And I was very interested in fighting communism because of those situations. And two of my uncles were very strong anti-communists. So I worked in CARP for many years and eventually went to UTS, graduated in '96, and then eventually worked in IEF and UPF. And I was able to be in Latvia and Lithuania during the coup in '91, which was a very tumultuous time. So what's happening in Ukraine now is millions of times worse than that time. But we had a tank outside of our hotel. We had gunboat helicopters flying around. I went into St. Petersburg during the middle of the coup. Eventually, after Gorbachev was taken to the Crimea, Yeltsin stood up on the tank and the whole coup fell apart. But I didn't know what was happening. June was pregnant with our second son, and everything goes dead. All the media goes dead, and they just play music. So you have no idea of what's going to happen. And here am I up in the Baltics, having a pregnant wife, and was supposed to go to Australia 3 weeks later, and she's freaking out, obviously, I knew. And all these stories from when I was young came to me at that time, and especially with what's happening in Ukraine, I can see those people suffering. And a lot of our translators and the people that we worked with were Ukrainians. They have a really strong Christian foundation. Sharon's going to share a little bit of her experience of them living in that region after I finish. So things really changed, but coming from an extremely humble background, eventually I joined UPF. And Karen Smith one day asked me, well, why don't you start working on this committee on which is called the Conference of NGOs. And these are committees that are actually very influential in the world. And because I've worked in Africa and UPF and worked in many different countries, I began as just one of the committee members, and then they appointed me as vice chair. And these are people with some 2 or 3 PhDs, very, very talented people. And eventually I became the chairman of the committee on HIV/AIDS. And even I had the opportunity to go to Thailand and address the board. These are the 47 committees which represent about half the world. The World Federalist Movement, very, very substantial organizations. So here am I coming from an extremely humble background, going to the seminary and finally graduating, and all of a sudden I'm addressing these world leaders, and as I did also in UPF with Dr. Wilson and other people. So sometimes God uses people from an extremely humble background to move forward. Very similar to President Lincoln. His background also, one of America's greatest presidents, born in a log cabin on the frontier. His mother died when he was young, and his father farmed him out as a laborer. So again, a very, very humble background. His family was also poor, held his shirts together with thorns, had very little schooling, but he loved to read. He educated himself to become a lawyer. So I don't know how many of you have done much work with lawyers, but that's not an easy thing to do, to be able to be self-educated like that. So this very poor, self-educated country lawyer became one of our greatest presidents. So again, God can use people if we have the right heart, right determination, and the right desire. So I want to talk a little bit about how these people have been able to have the dream of becoming successful. And we're going to do a visualization exercise in a little bit. So Dreams by Langston Hughes, and I have to thank June for this. Most of the books and everything that I utilize come from brilliant people like June. So I don't think I do most of this. So hold fast to your dreams, for if your dreams die, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to your dreams. For when dreams go, life is a barren field, frozen with snow. So a lot in our movement we talk about how we actualize these dreams. And we have a daily choice of what we do every day, right? Moving forward, flatlining, or going back. So goals are a choice, and it is a dream with deadlines. And short-term goals, medium-term goals, long-term goals, and action steps. How many of you make goals every day? I'll get into the question part of it now. For those of you who haven't heard my sermons much, you'll get asked a lot of questions. If you're sitting in the back seat, it's a very dangerous place to be. Stephanie, you'll get asked more. So, we want to be able to actualize our goals, right, to become successful. And a lot of times it's a question of whether we have gratitude, whether we're loving and we're caring, or we go into a complaint and jealousy mode, or we're looking at others and looking at other people's situation. And it's always easy to look at somebody else and say, well, Bob Honeycutt has this great restaurant. He's so much better than me. By the way, we had a very nice meal there last night, so and at some time you definitely want to go to this restaurant. It's a wonderful place. So it's easy to look at others and think someone's better than me, someone has more than me. But we want to be able to be grateful for what we have, and part of what we need to do is look at what we have and be able to move forward from that. And also find a balance in our lives. One of the biggest challenges, I think, for the first generation members is we either go too far on one side or too far on another side. And I see a lot with the younger people of today, and millennials, they go maybe too far on one side and more challenged on the other side. It's kind of interesting with our two sons, Emmanuel and Paul. Emmanuel's really good on the spiritual side, reading the gospel, really inspired by God. He's become almost a fundamentalist Christian. But he's struggling with finding a career and getting a job and doing all these other things. Our second son is really good financially. He's got a good financial planning job. He's down in Myrtle Beach. He's making a lot of money compared to what most of us maybe are making. And he's just starting to talk with the BC now, but his spiritual life needs some more work. So it's always this effort of how do we find balance and how do we move forward. So we need to look at all different elements of our lives, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and financially. Because if we're going to influence society, go out and visit churches, then we need to be able to open those doors. So the quality of our spiritual life then depends on how we guide and support our children and able to help and focus not only the second generation but the third generation. The first 3 years of life is when most of our personality is formed. So we can really look at those first couple of years of life, and the rest of it is trying to build our character. We have to be very intentional, focus on character development, community service, as a foundation for religious education. And as I've said quite a few times, a lot of our focus on religious education, I think, is not necessarily, we don't, unless they have the foundation to be able to understand that, they can't really connect with the complex theological notions. So this year we have a huge paradigm shift. And the paradigm shift, one, is the emergence of the second generation of leadership. And honestly speaking, when Naikimi, Mushiroda, and Milhan Stevens were appointed the president and vice president, I'm sitting there thinking, I'm not sure what you're doing there, Mother. This is a bit of a roll of the dice here. Because I knew them very well. I've known them for decades. And they're wonderful people. But I now realize that her capacity to put them into positions and have Dr. Yong as a coach raising them up was an incredibly wise choice. And second generation do have to take positions, and we as the first generation, I believe, have to become more coaches. So traditionally in our movement we're focused more on ministers and ambassadors for peace, but this year, and this is what we'll be talking about in our community meeting later, and Bob and I were talking about it last night, there's going to be more a focus on youth, young families, and university students. That's going to be the main focus for this whole year. So we're still going to do everything that we've done before, and you're going to have the choice of what you want to do. One of the really nice things I really appreciate about Naikimi with his business and coaching background is that he's giving people a choice. A lot of times in our movement, Tim, can you remember many times you were given choices of what you would want to do? No. We joined the army, right? And in the army, you don't get too many choices. It's, okay, you go to MFT now, and you're going to witness now, and after all that, you can start your family now. But young people are very different, and they have to be able to create something very different. And it's really good because we laid that foundation, but as we grow our movement, it's going to be very, very different in decades to come. And we have to see how these wonderful leaders can create that. The quality of our spiritual life, then, depends on what we're doing. So how we think about what we're going to create affects our lives and dreams. So what I'd like to do right now before I do this quote from Dr. Wayne Dyer, and he's really a big one about how we actualize our dreams, how we think about different things. As you can see, I do a lot of reading of his material, and he talks a lot about we are what we think. And what I'd like you to do right now is to take a moment, please close your eyes, and visualize where you want to be 5 or 10 years from now. I'd like to read from Dr. Wayne Dyer's book on research by Dr. Hawkins. This is not Stephen Hawkins, a different one. And he did a 29-year study on the interconnected universe. Every improvement we make in our private world improves the world at large for everyone. It's pretty amazing research. He states, and this is very pertinent to what's happening in the Ukraine and other countries. One individual who lives and vibrates to the energy of optimism and a willingness to be non-judgmental of others will counterbalance the negativity of 90,000 individuals who calibrate at the lower, weakening levels. One individual who lives and vibrates to the energy of pure love and reverence for all life will counterbalance the negativity of 750,000 individuals who calibrate at the lower levels. one individual who lives and vibrates to the energy of illumination, bliss, and infinite peace will counterbalance the negativity of 10 million people who calibrate at the lower weakening level. Approximately 22 such sages are alive today. One individual who lives and vibrates to the energy of grace, pure spirit beyond the body, in a world of non-duality or complete oneness will counterbalance the negativity of 70 million people who calibrate at the lower weakening levels. There are 10 of those sages alive today. I always thought, why haven't we had nuclear holocaust, which we're very close to at this stage right now? Here are two compelling statistics offered by Dr. Hawkins in his 29-year studies on the hidden determinants of human behavior. One single avatar at the highest level of consciousness in this period of history, to whom the title Lord is appropriate, Lord Jesus Christ, and as we would say as unificationists, Father and Mother Moon, counterbalance the collective negativity of all of mankind in today's world. The negativity of the entire human population would self-destruct were if it not were this counteracting effects of these higher energy fields. So there's a powerful energy, and as we know, there's a certain amount of power in dictators like Putin, but there's also this counterbalancing spiritual energy as well. Fascinating research. So what we want to try and do then is be able to create that positive energy through our dreams, through our goals, through our vision. And what Dr. Yong has been talking a lot about on morning devotion is how do you actualize the words of Father and Mother Moon and the Bible through spiritual conditions, Dongsong conditions, study and prayer conditions, and be able to create a new reality. And I believe through that positive energy we can do that, and I've experienced that a lot in my life. How then do we cultivate the heart through these dreams? In Asian philosophy, they talk a lot about filial piety, which is a very vertical condition. But combined for that, I think for the Western world, we have to be able to focus on a more horizontal element through the virtues, and that's why Jun and I and others have been doing character education for a long time. And especially the virtues of respect, empathy, and compassion, which empathy is, compassion is putting that empathy into practice and respecting others. And that must be combined with a Christ-centered agape love, because we all want unconditional love. We all want that absolute love. And we look for that in our spouse, but are our spouses unconditional? Anne's laughing over here. Obviously our spouses aren't. We're not only not absolute, we're not even unconditional, we're very relativized beings. And it's only with this Christ-centered love that we can become more unconditional, more loving, and more connected. So we have to understand our value in society. A lot of times I feel there's a lot of depression in the world, a lot of situation. Last year we had 80,000 suicides or deaths of despair. A lot to do with COVID, but a lot of it also had to do with the opioid crisis. So we have to be able to look at ourselves, value ourselves as Christ-centered beings, value our family members, friends, and people in society, and especially respect nature and creation. So the mission then of Envision this year of our movement is to build a peaceful world by empowering families through parents, Father and Mother Moon, teaching the holy marriage blessing of how we can become more Christ-centered, more agape-centered. And this is where it gets kind of interesting, because the 5 goals arose from the challenges of all of our communities around. So these are our national goals, and this is what we're going to be talking about in our community meeting. And the thing I really, really appreciate about Nayakimi, and for those of you that have ever done goal setting, a lot of times as parents we set goals for our young people, right? And then they don't achieve those goals, because why? because they're our goals, they're not their goals. So we have to switch that around and help them understand. So these 5 goals came out of meetings with the regional directors. The first is leadership development, and Bob is doing a course, an Accelerate course on that. Preparing singles for the holy marriage blessing, establishing new blessed couples through the 40 days, 43 days, 40 days of separation and 3 days of starting a new beginning. Engaging and educating young families, especially with children under the age of 17, and supporting global missions in Africa and other developing countries. So the nice thing about this is you can choose any one of these goals that you feel you want to invest in. And even whether you want to work with young people, young families, with ministers, helping them connect in society, or ambassadors for peace who are working more in the political or in the community, it's your choice. Whatever you want to do. So we'll be talking about these goals and what you want to do. The interesting news before I invite Sharon up to talk about her experiences in Eastern Europe, especially with the Russian and Ukrainian students, being a missionary in that region. At the end of this month, March 27th, Dr. Shiel will be coming to give the sermon here. And then at the end of April, we have an opportunity to invite Dr. Yong if we want to. And he wants to see community leaders, youth leaders, students, young families. And he wants to connect on that level. So again, we have a huge paradigm shift. This is not going to be a summit where we have discussions with ministers and community leaders. This is focused on the next generation. How can we raise up this next generation to be more self-actualized, to be more successful, and to move forward?